The moment the orders stopped coming, the German prisoners waited for punishment, confusion, or chaos. But instead, they discovered something far more disturbing, because even without guards shouting, whistles blowing, or threats hanging in the air, the camp continued to function exactly as it always had. And that was when they realized the most frightening truth of all. Nothing was forcing them anymore, yet nothing had changed. When the guards stopped giving commands, the men noticed it slowly, not as a sudden event, but as an absence that crept into the camp like a change in the weather that no one could quite explain. There was no announcement, no signal, and no formal declaration that anything had ended or begun, yet the familiar rhythm that had governed their days for months no longer came from outside the fences. Whistles were silent, shouted instructions were gone, and the watchtowers stood as empty silhouettes against the sky, observing nothing and enforcing nothing. At first, the prisoners assumed it was temporary. In war, silence often meant preparation, and the absence of orders felt less like freedom and more like a pause before something worse. Men stood in small groups, glancing toward the gates, waiting for correction, punishment, or the inevitable return of authority. Yet nothing happened. Minutes passed, then hours, and still no one came to restore the structure that had once dictated every movement of their bodies. What unsettled them was not the lack of guards, but the way their own behavior refused to change. Even without instruction, they rose at the same hour, folded their blankets with practiced precision, and lined up where roll call used to take place, standing quietly as if an invisible officer were still watching. No one ordered them to do so, yet no one suggested leaving the line either. The habits drilled into them over months of captivity had not faded with the removal of control, because the control had already moved somewhere else. The camp itself seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. The fences no longer appeared threatening, and the gates no longer symbolized confinement, but the men did not approach them. Instead, they remained within the boundaries they had memorized, moving along familiar paths worn into the dirt by repetition rather than necessity. Freedom, when it appeared without instruction, felt less like opportunity and more like uncertainty. Some prisoners whispered that it was a test, a psychological trick designed to expose weakness or provoke disorder. Others believed the guards were nearby, watching from a distance, waiting for a mistake that would justify severe consequences. These explanations provided comfort because they preserved the idea that someone else was still in control. The alternative was far more unsettling because it suggested that the system they obeyed no longer existed outside their own minds. As the days passed, the absence of orders did not bring relief. Instead, it produced anxiety that settled deep beneath the surface, quiet but persistent. Without commands to follow, decisions had to be made, and choice had become unfamiliar, even dangerous. Men hesitated before acting, not because they lacked permission, but because they no longer trusted their own judgment. Every movement carried the weight of responsibility they had not carried since before their capture. The realization came slowly, and when it did, it was not spoken aloud. The camp still operated, meals were taken at the same time, routines were preserved, and discipline maintained itself without enforcement. The guards had not removed order. They had simply revealed where it truly lived. What frightened the prisoners was not the loss of control, but the discovery that they had internalized it so completely that it no longer needed to be imposed. By the end of the first week, the truth had become impossible to ignore. The prisoners were no longer following orders because there were none left to follow. They were obeying something far more powerful, something that could not be disarmed or dismissed because it existed entirely within them. And once that understanding settled in, the camp no longer needed fences to keep anyone inside. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the absence of orders stretched into another day, the men began to notice that what guided them now was no longer fear of punishment or hope of reward, but habit itself, moving quietly beneath the surface of conscious thought. The camp woke at the same hour not because anyone demanded it, but because waking then felt natural, almost necessary, as if time itself still belonged to the old routine. They moved through the yard along familiar paths, tracing lines worn into the ground by repetition rather than instruction. No one told them where to walk, yet no one wandered far. The boundaries they respected were no longer enforced by guards or fences, but by memory, reinforced each time a man chose the familiar over the uncertain. Staying within known spaces required no explanation, while stepping beyond them demanded a reason no one felt prepared to give. This obedience to habit created a strange calm. Without shouted commands or visible authority, the camp felt quieter than it ever had. Yet that quiet did not bring peace. Instead, it sharpened awareness. Men listened closely to their own movements, to the sound of boots on dirt, to the rustle of fabric, as if noise itself might reveal deviation. They adjusted their behavior automatically, lowering voices and slowing gestures, not because silence was required, but because silence felt safer. The most unsettling realization was how little effort this restraint required. No one struggled against it. No one openly resisted. The routines continued because they were easier than imagining alternatives. Habit spared the men from making decisions, and in doing so, it shielded them from responsibility. Choosing not to choose became a form of comfort, a way to exist without confronting uncertainty. Some men tested the limits cautiously, altering small details rather than making bold moves. A delayed step, a missed routine, a longer pause in the yard, each adjustment was followed by watchful stillness, waiting for a reaction that never came. The absence of consequence confirmed what many already sensed, that the structure governing their lives no longer depended on enforcement, but on expectation. Expectation, once established, proved powerful. Men began to sense when behavior felt appropriate and when it did not, even without rules to define the difference. This sense did not come from logic, but from the collective rhythm forming quietly among them. Deviating from that rhythm felt uncomfortable, not because it was dangerous, but because it separated the individual from the group. As days passed, this separation became something to avoid. Belonging mattered more than freedom, and alignment felt more reassuring than independence. The men had survived captivity by blending in, by avoiding attention, and by following patterns that minimized risk. Now, those same instincts guided them in the absence of control, preserving order without requiring anyone to demand it. What emerged was a system that appeared voluntary, even reasonable, yet left little room for initiative. The men did not perceive themselves as controlled because no one was controlling them. They believed they were simply being careful, practical, and sensible. In reality, habit had taken command, filling the space where authority once stood. By the end of this phase, the camp functioned smoothly without orders. Discipline maintained itself without force, and the absence of reaction to disobedience became irrelevant because disobedience no longer occurred. The men had learned how to continue without instruction, and in doing so, they had discovered that control does not always arrive from outside, because sometimes it survives through repetition alone. As habits settled deeper into daily life, the men gradually became aware that order was no longer something they followed individually, but but something they maintained together, often without realizing when or how that shift had occurred. No rule announced this change, and no voice acknowledged it. Yet behavior began to align across the camp with remarkable consistency, as if an invisible agreement had taken shape. They noticed it in the way glances lingered. A movement that strayed slightly from routine drew quiet attention, not hostile or accusatory, but observant, as though the group itself were measuring balance. A pause held too long, or a gesture made too openly invited stillness from those nearby, creating a subtle pressure to return to what felt acceptable. No words were exchanged, and none were needed, because the reaction itself carried meaning. This mutual awareness altered how the men experienced one another. Each person understood that his actions now contributed to the stability of the whole, and that instability, once introduced, would not be corrected by authority, but absorbed by those around him. The responsibility for order had dispersed quietly, settling across the group rather than resting on any single figure. In this environment, standing apart did not feel rebellious, it felt disruptive. Disruption carried its own cost. It threatened the calm that had replaced fear, and calm had become precious. The absence of shouting and punishment made the camp feel livable, even tolerable, and no one wanted to risk the return of chaos by drawing attention. In protecting the calm, the men began protecting the very structure that constrained them, even though no one openly acknowledged this contradiction. Over time, anticipation replaced reaction. Men adjusted themselves before others needed to respond, aligning behavior preemptively with what felt expected. This anticipation created an illusion of choice, because every action appeared voluntary. Yet the range of acceptable behavior narrowed steadily. The group no longer needed to correct deviation, because deviation learned how to disappear. What made this dynamic especially powerful was its neutrality. There were no punishments and no rewards, only the quiet discomfort of being out of step. That discomfort did not come from fear of authority, but from the risk of isolation, a risk that felt heavier after months of shared survival. Remaining synchronized with the group offered reassurance, while acting independently introduced uncertainty no one wished to face. The camp, once defined by enforced order, now reflected collective restraint. From a distance, it might have appeared calm and orderly, even cooperative. Inside, the calm was sustained through constant awareness, each man carrying a share of responsibility for maintaining it. Control no longer belonged to guards or systems, but circulated silently through observation, expectation, and habit. By this stage, disobedience no longer required suppression. It had lost relevance. The men did not follow orders because there were none to follow, and they did not break rules because the group had already absorbed them. What remained was a shared understanding of how to behave, reinforced not by force, but by the quiet desire to belong and the equally quiet fear of standing alone. As this understanding settled into permanence, the camp revealed a truth the men had never anticipated, which was that obedience could survive without authority, not because it was demanded, but because it was mutually preserved, transforming freedom into something that existed in theory, but felt increasingly unnecessary in practice. As the quiet system of mutual observation settled into permanence, the men began to sense that the concept of wrongdoing itself had changed, because error was no longer something that triggered response from authority, but something that produced immediate internal discomfort. There were still actions that felt wrong, not because they violated a rule, but because they disturbed the balance the group had learned to preserve. This shift altered how the men evaluated their own behavior. They no longer asked whether an action was allowed or forbidden, but whether it felt appropriate within the shared rhythm that governed daily life. Appropriateness became the new measure, subtle and undefined, yet widely understood. An action could be technically harmless and still feel unacceptable if it disrupted the quiet order everyone relied on. The absence of punishment made this judgment more powerful, not less. Without external consequences, responsibility could not be transferred or blamed on authority. Every decision belonged fully to the individual, and that ownership created hesitation. Men learned to avoid actions that might introduce uncertainty, even if those actions posed no real risk, because uncertainty threatened the fragile calm that had replaced fear. Mistakes, when they occurred, were handled without confrontation. A man who moved too quickly, spoke too loudly, or acted out of sequence was not corrected directly. Instead, the response came as silence, stillness, or subtle withdrawal from those nearby. This response required no explanation because its meaning was immediately understood. It signaled misalignment rather than guilt, and misalignment felt more uncomfortable than reprimand ever had. Over time, this dynamic reshaped behavior more effectively than strict enforcement. Men adjusted their actions constantly, not to avoid punishment, but to avoid standing out. The goal was no longer obedience, but invisibility within the group. To blend in meant safety, and safety had become the highest priority in a world where direction had vanished. The most unsettling aspect of this transformation was how rational it appeared. The men believed they were choosing caution, cooperation, and restraint, unaware that these choices were narrowing their sense of possibility. Each avoided mistake reinforced the idea that staying within familiar patterns was wise, while experimentation was unnecessary and potentially harmful. As this mindset took hold, initiative became rare. The camp functioned smoothly, precisely because nothing new was attempted. Stability was maintained not through progress, but through repetition, and repetition created the illusion that everything was under control. In reality, control had simply changed form, becoming internal and collective rather than external and imposed. By this stage, the men no longer needed to be reminded of consequences, because consequences were felt immediately within the self. The system no longer corrected actions, it shaped intentions. What once required enforcement now required only awareness, and awareness proved more restrictive than any rule. In this way, the camp completed its transformation. It was no longer a place where mistakes were punished, but a place where mistakes were anticipated and avoided before they occurred, ensuring that order remained intact without anyone needing to intervene, and leaving the men trapped not by fear, but by their own careful restraint. As the camp continued to function without interruption, the men gradually came to understand that stability itself had become the central value shaping every decision, because change now carried a weight that felt heavier than stagnation. Nothing demanded movement, nothing encouraged disruption, and in that absence of pressure, the existing order gained strength simply by persisting. Daily life unfolded with quiet efficiency. Tasks were completed without instruction, spaces were respected without enforcement, and interactions followed patterns that required no discussion. Each repetition reinforced the sense that this way of living was sufficient, even preferable, because it removed the burden of uncertainty. The men did not feel oppressed by this arrangement, because it asked very little of them beyond continued participation. Leaving this system would have required more than physical movement. It would have required redefining identity, abandoning shared understanding, and accepting responsibility for outcomes that could no longer be attributed to circumstance or authority. For individuals conditioned to survive through adaptation rather than initiative, this demand felt unreasonable. Staying offered continuity, while departure offered nothing but unanswered questions. Over time, the idea of change began to feel unnecessary. If life functioned smoothly, if conflict was absent, and if needs were met within familiar limits, then altering the arrangement seemed irrational. The men reasoned that waiting preserved safety, that patience demonstrated wisdom, and that clarity would eventually arrive on its own. In the meantime, maintaining the present felt like the most sensible course. This reasoning spread quietly, not through persuasion, but through observation. Each man saw others remaining in place, fulfilling routines, and avoiding disruption, and interpreted this behavior as confirmation that staying was correct. Collective inaction became self-validating, reinforcing the belief that movement was neither urgent nor beneficial. The camp, once a symbol of confinement, had transformed into a system defined by continuity. Its structures no longer imposed restriction. They provided reassurance. The predictability that once represented control now represented stability, and stability had become indistinguishable from safety. Within this environment, freedom existed as an abstract concept rather than a practical choice. What made this stage especially enduring was the absence of conflict. No force opposed the men, and no crisis demanded response. Without tension to resolve, there was no catalyst for change. The system maintained itself not through strength, but through calm, and calm discouraged action more effectively than fear ever had. By the time the men recognized how deeply they had settled into this state, it no longer felt like something that could be reversed easily. Remaining had become the path of least resistance, reinforced daily through comfort, familiarity, and shared restraint. The idea of leaving still existed, but it had lost urgency, relevance, and emotional pull. In this way, the camp reached a quiet equilibrium. Nothing compelled the men to stay, yet nothing motivated them to go. Control no longer needed to assert itself, because the desire to maintain balance had replaced the need for authority. The system endured not because it was enforced, but because it worked well enough to discourage change. And so life continued, unchanged not by force or fear, but by the simple fact that staying required nothing more than continuing to do what had already become normal. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment when control fully detached itself from authority, because that separation had already taken place quietly through repetition rather than decision. The men did not experience a clear turning point, only a gradual acceptance of a life that continued without interruption, guided by habits that no longer required justification. What they discovered was not that freedom had been denied, but that freedom had become irrelevant. Without orders to follow, they continued as they always had, preserving routines that offered comfort and predictability in a world stripped of certainty. The absence of command did not create chaos, because obedience had already learned how to survive on its own. The camp no longer needed guards to enforce behavior, rules to define limits, or punishment to maintain order. Control had settled into the ordinary, sustained by familiarity, mutual observation, and a quiet desire to avoid disruption. Each man believed he was choosing stability, unaware that stability had become the most effective form of restraint. In this environment, nothing forced the men to stay, yet nothing invited them to leave. The systems that once confined them had dissolved, replaced by patterns that felt natural, reasonable, and safe. What remained was a space where change required courage, and courage demanded uncertainty that no one felt prepared to face. The story ends not with defiance or escape, but with continuity, leaving behind an unsettling truth that control does not always rely on power, because sometimes it endures through routine alone, shaping behavior long after authority has disappeared. And in that quiet persistence, the camp revealed its final lesson, that the strongest systems are not those that command obedience, but those that teach people how to continue without being told. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.